The rejection happened in front of everyone. Not in a private chamber. Not in a whispered hallway. Not with the decency of lowered eyes or a trembling voice.
No.
Silas did it in the great hall of Duskfang Keep, under the iron chandeliers dripping with tallow light, with 200 wolves watching, warriors, elders, pups, and servants, every single one of them holding their breath as their alpha raised his hand and pointed at Anastasia like she was something he had found stuck to the bottom of his boot. I, Silas Holt, alpha of the Duskfang Pack, reject you, Anastasia Vane, as my fated mate. You are unworthy of this bond, unworthy of this pack, and unworthy of my name. The words hit her like a blade through the chest. Not because she loved him. She did not. But because every wolf in that hall immediately dropped their gaze, and in doing so, they told her everything. They had known. Every single one of them had known this was coming, and not one had thought to warn her. Not her childhood friend, Petra, who now stared at the stone floor with red-rimmed eyes but said nothing. Not Elder Torin, who had watched Anastasia grow from a pup and now examined his own hands with great interest. Not even her own cousin, Bram, who stood near the back with his jaw tight and his fists clenched, but still
said
nothing. They had all chosen the pack over her. And behind Silas, wearing a satisfied little smile that she had always suspected but never been able to prove, stood Nadine, copper-haired, sharp-eyed, silk-dressed Nadine, the beta's daughter, who had been circling Silas for the better part of 3 years. Anastasia understood then. This was not rejection. This was removal. Carefully planned, deliberately public, designed to strip her of every shred of standing so thoroughly that no wolf, in any territory, would dare to take her in. She could have wept. She could have begged. She could have dropped to her knees on that cold stone floor and pleaded with the mate bond, with the moon goddess, with whatever scrap of mercy still lived in Silas Holt's chest. She did none of those things. Instead, Anastasia Vane lifted her chin, looked Silas directly in the eye, and she smiled. It was not a kind smile. Well, she said, her voice carrying clean and steady across that silent hall, that is the greatest relief I have felt in 22 years of living. Someone in the back coughed. Someone else made a sound that might, very generously, have been described as a laugh quickly smothered. Silas's jaw tightened. You will leave Duskfang territory by sunrise, he said. Oh, I'll be gone long before sunrise. She turned on her heel. I wouldn't want to overstay a welcome that was never real to begin with. She walked out of the great hall with her spine straight and her hands ice cold and her heart breaking in absolute silence. Because here is the thing about Anastasia Vane that no one in Duskfang ever fully understood, and the thing that Silas Holt, in his spectacular arrogance, had catastrophically failed to consider.
She was not ordinary.
She had always known it, in the way you know a fire is hot before you touch it. There was something in her blood that sat differently, something in her wolf that ran deeper, faster, darker than it should. She had spent years suppressing it, hiding it, making herself small and palatable and useful to a pack that looked at her power with more suspicion than pride. Now, as she crossed the courtyard in the bitter night air of early winter, the suppression cracked. And far away, farther than any Duskfang wolf had ever run, beyond the Greymoor border and the cursed Ashfin marshes and the long black ridge of the Stone Spine Mountains, a king felt it. A very old, very dangerous king. He sat up from his war table, sending a goblet clattering to the stone floor, and he turned his face north like a wolf scenting prey on the wind. His general, a scarred veteran named Hugo who had survived 3 wars and once wrestled a bear with his bare hands, took one look at his king's expression and quietly backed toward the door. My king. Caleb did not answer right away. His silver eyes were distant, fixed on something no one else in the room could see. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and absolute. "Ready my horse." Hugo stared. "It is the middle of the night, sire." "I am aware of when it is, Hugo. We are in the middle of a campaign. The Northern Lords are 3 days from." "Ready."
My
"Horse." Hugo readied the horse. And so it began. Chapter 1. To understand Anastasia, you must understand Duskfang. Duskfang Pack was not the largest territory in the northern werewolf kingdoms, but it was among the most prestigious. Old bloodlines, deep forest land, a history of military strength that had kept its borders intact for 2 centuries. It had survived wars, plagues, the long winters that killed lesser packs, and the political upheavals that reshaped territories every generation. What it had never survived, until now, was peace. Because peace, it turned out, made wolves petty. When there was no external enemy to unite them, they found enemies within. Old grudges calcified. Social hierarchies became weapons. And at the center of every social hierarchy in a werewolf pack was the alpha and his fated mate. Anastasia had been identified as Silas Holt's fated mate at the age of 16, when they had been at a joint hunt with the neighboring Ironmoss pack, and the mate bond had announced itself with all the subtlety of a thunderclap, a shared look, a catch of breath, the undeniable pull of fate. Silas had been 17. He had turned away from her within 10 seconds of the recognition. That, she now understood, had been the first sign. She had spent 6 years in that pack as the alpha's unclaimed mate. Not rejected. He had never formally rejected her, but never claimed either. It was a uniquely uncomfortable position, like being a door that everyone could see but no one was allowed to open. She held status by virtue of the bond's existence. She held no power because he refused to acknowledge it. She had made herself useful instead. Anastasia was sharp in the way that grows in people who have too much time to observe and too little power to act. She learned herb lore from the pack's healer, an ancient woman named Oswin who smelled permanently of pine resin and had the personality of a particularly opinionated mountain. She learned the pack's history from Elder Torin in the years before he decided silence was safer than loyalty. She trained with the warriors because the alternative was sitting in the great hall being pitted, and she had always found pity intolerable. She became good. Better than good. Torin had once muttered, in a rare unguarded moment, that she ran faster than any wolf her age had a right to, and that her instincts in a fight were disquietingly refined. "Disquieting," she had repeated. "For a female of your rank," he had clarified hastily. "Ah," she had said. "You mean for a female who is supposed to stand quietly and wait to be claimed." Torin had not answered. The years passed. Silas grew into his alpha power. His father stepped down, and the pack watched with uncomfortable fascination as their new alpha continued to pretend his fated mate did not exist. Whispers followed Anastasia everywhere. Some pitied her. Some resented her. She took up space that a properly installed Luna should have occupied, and her continued, unclaimed presence was a constant awkward reminder of a situation no one knew how to resolve. And then Nadine arrived. Nadine was not Silas's fated mate. Everyone knew this. The bond between fated pairs had a signature that wolves could sense, a pull, a resonance, something that made the air between two people hum with the moon goddess's intention. Silas and Nadine had nothing like that. What they had instead was convenience and ambition dressed up as affection, which, in Anastasia's experience, was far more dangerous than love. She had watched Nadine work her way into Silas's confidence over 3 years with the patient precision of a woman who had identified her goal and was simply executing the steps required to reach it. Anastasia had felt no jealousy. The mate bond was a fact of her existence, not a feeling she had cultivated, but she had felt something colder and more practical. She had felt afraid, not of losing Silas. She had never had Silas to lose. Afraid of what his rejection would mean for her survival. A rejected mate was not simply a social embarrassment. In the hierarchy of wolf packs, a formally rejected female, one whose alpha had publicly severed the bond, was branded. Every pack would know. And while some progressive territories in the southern kingdoms might accept a rejected mate without stigma, the North was not progressive. The North was old, and the old ways said a rejected mate was flawed, tainted, unworthy. No alpha in the North would take her in as a full pack member. She would be a wanderer at best, prey at worst. She had told herself she was prepared. She had not been prepared. Nothing prepares you for 200 people watching you be discarded. She packed one bag in the dark of her chamber, her herb kit, her warmest cloak, a hunting knife that had belonged to her mother, the small leather journal she had kept for years filled with observations and plant drawings and, if she was honest, the words she had never been allowed to say out loud. She took no food from the kitchens. She would not give them the satisfaction of thinking she had scrambled. She was at the north gate when Petra found her. Petra, who had been her closest friend since childhood. Petra, with her messy brown hair and her habit of talking too fast and her laugh that sounded like water over rocks, who had stood in that hall and looked at the floor. Anna. Petra's voice was thick. Anna, please. Don't. Anastasia did not stop walking. I already know what you're going to say. I didn't know he was going to do it tonight. I swear to the goddess I didn't know. But you knew he was going to do it. Silence. Anastasia stopped. She turned to look at her oldest friend, who was standing in the torchlight with tears running freely down her face, and she felt something in her chest go very, very quiet. How long? She asked. Petra wiped her face. 3 months. 3 months. Petra had known for 3 months. Did you think, Anastasia said carefully, that I might have appreciated a warning? Even a vague one? Something like, oh, I don't know. Anna, you might want to have a bag packed. I was afraid, Petra whispered. If Silas found out I told you, then you made your choice. Anastasia turned back to the gate. I hope it keeps you warm. Anna. Goodbye, Petra. She walked through the gate and did not look back. The forest swallowed her within minutes, the great dark pine-end shadow of the northern wood closing around her like a fist. She walked until the lights of Duskfang Keep had vanished entirely, and the only sound was the wind through the branches and the distant call of an owl. Then she stopped, braced her hand against the trunk of an enormous oak, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of shaking. Not crying. She was too angry to cry. But the shaking happened, a full-body tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. The cold she could barely feel, which was in itself strange, because it was deep winter, and she was a wolf without a pack, and she should have been freezing. She was not freezing. She was warm. She was burning, actually, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with that cracking she had felt in the great hall. As if something that had been held shut for a very long time was slowly, inexorably, beginning to open. Her wolf stirred, restless and large, and not at all comfortable in the shape Anastasia had spent years keeping her in. Not yet, she whispered. Her wolf subsided, but only barely. She straightened, looked up at the black winter sky through the interlaced branches, found the silver moon, and thought, where do you go when you have nowhere to go? She was still thinking about it when she heard the hoofbeats. Chapter 2. There were things that were said about the Lycan King, and there were things that were true, and the overlap between those two categories was smaller than most people imagined. What was said, Caleb Drave was a monster. A king made of war and stone and silence, who had inherited the Lycan throne at 19 and immediately demonstrated his fitness for it by ending a 4-decade border conflict in 8 months through a combination of tactical brilliance and the kind of personal violence that made hardened soldiers talk in low voices afterward. He had no queen, no consort, no known weakness. He had ruled the Lycan Kingdom, the oldest and most powerful werewolf territory on the continent, for 11 years with an iron grip and very little warmth. What was true? All of that. And also the thing that nobody talked about, which was that Caleb Drave was tired. Not physically tired. Lycans were built for endurance. Their bloodline ran older and deeper than common werewolves, their wolves larger and more dangerous, their lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades. He could run for 3 days without rest and fight for 10 hours without flagging. He was tired in the bone-deep, marrow-quiet way of a man who had spent 11 years being exactly what everyone needed him to be, and not one single day being anything else. He had been 19 when his father died. 19 when the court looked at him with that particular brand of calculated assessment that said, clear as speech, we will follow you if you are strong enough, and destroy you if you are not. 19 when he had looked back at them and understood that warmth was a luxury he could not afford. He had not been warm since. He was not thinking about any of this as he rode north on a horse that was beginning to deeply resent the midnight pace. He was thinking about her. The bond signature he had felt had been unlike anything in his experience, and his experience was extensive. Lycan kings could sense their fated mates from extraordinary distances. It was an aspect of their bloodline, one of the things that set Lycans apart from common wolf packs, but the sensation was typically subtle at first. A faint pull, a warmth at the back of the mind, something to be followed gradually. This had not been subtle. This had been a crack of lightning behind his eyes. This had been the sensation of something vast and old and deeply, deeply powerful suddenly releasing from whatever had been containing it, like a dam breaking, except the flood was alive. In 11 years on the throne, he had touched the edge of the mate bond perhaps half a dozen times. Faint traces, nothing that resolved into clarity, nothing that pulled him more than a passing interest in a direction. He had begun, quietly and with considerable self-discipline, to make peace with the possibility that his mate might not exist, that he might be one of those rare Lycans who live the full arc of their long lives without the bond ever completing. He had made peace with it. He had apparently made peace with it prematurely. He slowed his horse at the edge of a forest he recognized, the outer border of Duskfang territory, a common wolf pack of no particular distinction that he knew by reputation and map reference, and very little else. The pull was coming from inside the trees. He dismounted, handed his horse to the 2 soldiers who had managed to keep up, they would catch the rest in a moment, and walked to the tree-line. He stood there for a moment, listening. The forest was cold and dark and smelled of pine and frost and something else. Something warm and strange and entirely arresting, like a fire in a snowstorm. He stepped between the trees. He found her approximately a quarter mile in, standing with her back against an oak and her chin tipped up toward the sky, looking at the moon with the expression of a person conducting a very serious internal argument. She was not what he had expected. He was not certain what he had expected. 11 years of solitary rulership had done nothing to prepare him for the experience of looking at a woman and feeling the world simply stop. She was tall for a female wolf, not quite his height, but close. Dark hair loose around her shoulders. A traveling cloak that had seen better years. One bag across her back, one knife at her hip. Standing alone in a forest in the middle of the night, looking like she owned it. She heard him at about 10 paces, which, he noted, was impressive. He had been moving quietly.
She turned.
Her eyes met his. The bond hit them both at the same moment, a shockwave of recognition so absolute that he actually felt his next step falter. He who had walked through battlefields without flinching. He who had stared down 6 alphas simultaneously at the last Continental Council and made them all look away first. Her eyes widened. Then, immediately, her expression shifted into something that was simultaneously wary and dry. "Of course," she said. He blinked. In his 11 years as king, nobody had ever said "of course" to his face. "Of course," he repeated. "I've just been formally rejected by 1 alpha. It would be perfectly on schedule for the universe to immediately introduce me to another one." She looked him over with an assessment that was almost insultingly thorough. Her gaze went from his face to his armor. He was still in his campaign gear, which was not glamorous, to his boots, which were muddy and back up. "You're a Lycan." "Yes." "A high-ranking one, by the look of it." "Also yes." "Are you going to tell me you're the king, or are we going to stand here pretending?" A beat of silence. "I'm the king," he said. She pressed her fingers briefly over her eyes.
"Right."
"Of course you are." She lowered her hand and looked at him with an expression that was magnificent in its exhaustion. "I don't suppose you could have found me literally any other night?" "The bond doesn't consult my calendar," he said, before he quite knew he was going to say it. Something crossed her face, surprise, quickly shuddered. As if she hadn't expected him to be capable of something that sounded even faintly like humor. "No," she agreed. "I don't suppose it does." She looked at him for a long moment, really looked the way people look when they are trying very hard to make a decision they already know the answer to. The bond hummed between them like a plucked string, insistent and warm and absolutely certain. "My name is Anastasia Vane," she said at last. "I have approximately 3 hours before sunrise, no pack, no territory, and a formal rejection on my record that will make me unwelcome in every northern wolf territory between here and the coast." She paused. "I don't know what the etiquette is for meeting your fated mate in a forest at midnight directly after being thrown out of your pack, but I suspect it involves more ceremony than either of us currently has available." Caleb studied her. The exhaustion in her eyes was real, but underneath it was something else, a fierce, contained intelligence and a particular brand of defiance that he recognized because he had cultivated the same thing in himself, though he had had to do it in a throne room rather than at the end of a rejection ceremony. "The etiquette," he said, "is whatever we make it." Another surprised flash across her face. Then, slowly, something that was not quite a smile, but was perhaps the ancestor of one. "I'll need a moment," she said. "I have time." She turned back to the oak tree, pressed both hands flat against the bark, and was quiet for approximately 30 seconds. He waited. He had the impression that a great many things were happening inside that silence that he was not privy to. Then she straightened, pulled her cloak tighter, and turned around. "All right," she said. "I'm listening." Chapter 3. He did not take her back to his war camp, which was her first clue that whatever this was, he was taking it seriously. Instead, he sent a message ahead. One of his soldiers had a swift horse and a look of well-practiced neutrality that suggested he had learned not to ask questions, and redirected their route towards Stonecrest Hold, a garrison fortress at the edge of Lycan territory that served as a way station for the kingdom's military campaigns. They rode side by side, which was another thing she noted. He could have put her behind him, or behind a guard, or in a cart. He had not. "You feel it," he said, when they had been riding for an hour in a silence that was not, she had to admit, entirely uncomfortable. The bond. She considered pretending she didn't know what he meant, then decided against it. She was too tired for pretense.
"Yes."
"I felt it the moment I looked at you." "You weren't surprised." "I was surprised," she corrected. "I said of course, which I admit was not my most articulate response. But the bond itself, I've been aware of something running under my surface for years. Something that wasn't Silas. This just..." She searched for the word. Resolved it. He was quiet for a moment. She had the impression he was working through whether to say the next thing. I felt you from 2 territories away, he said. She turned to look at him. His profile in the moonlight was sharp, strong jaw, a nose that had been broken at some point and healed slightly crooked, the kind of face that had been carved by weather and consequence rather than beauty. He was looking at the road ahead. When the rejection happened, he continued, something released. I felt it like a blow. The image of Silas's face floated through her mind, that cold, deliberate cruelty, and she pushed it down. I didn't know that was possible, she said. It isn't common. He glanced at her briefly. What exactly have you been suppressing? I don't know, she said, which was the honest answer. My wolf. My power. Whatever it is that makes wolves in Duskfang look at me like I'm a problem they can't classify. Did they look at you that way often? Only every day of my life. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact, and something in his expression shifted. Not pity, she would have noticed pity. Something else. Recognition, maybe. What do you know about Lycan mates? He asked. Less than I probably should, given the circumstances. She paused. I know Lycans are the oldest bloodline. I know your wolves are larger and your lifespan's longer and your political structures are different from common packs. You have a monarchy rather than a council of alphas. I know the last Lycan King before you ruled for nearly 200 years. My grandfather. I know that Lycan female pairings are. I believe the word I've seen in the old texts is extraordinary. In terms of what it produces. Also accurate. She thought about this. Is that why you came yourself, rather than sending an emissary? He was quiet for a beat too long, which told her the real answer before he gave the diplomatic one. The bond required it, he said. The bond, she repeated. Right. She looked forward at the dark road. I'd like to be clear about something. I thought you might. I have been in a pack for 22 years that used the mate bond as a leash. I was never claimed, never given standing, never given power, but I could never leave either because rejecting a fated bond yourself, initiating the rejection rather than receiving it, has social consequences almost as severe. I was held in place by a bond one never chose. She turned to look at him directly. I'm not doing that again. I don't care what bloodline you are, I don't care what the bond says, and I don't care that you are apparently the single most powerful werewolf on the continent. If this becomes something that controls me, I leave. Rejected mark and all. He met her gaze. His silver eyes were steady, unreadable in the way of a person who had spent a long time not being read. Understood, he said. That's all you're going to say? What would you like me to say? She thought about it. Something that suggests you actually heard me, rather than just logging it as a thing an agitated female said that you'll politely ignore once I'm inside your walls. The corner of his mouth moved. It was almost nothing, a slight shift that in another face might have been the beginning of a smile. I heard you, he said. I've ruled a kingdom for 11 years. I'm aware that power held by force lasts exactly as long as the force. I have no interest in a mate I've compelled. He paused. And for what it's worth, I don't find you agitated. I find you precise. The word landed oddly in her chest. Not praise, exactly. Something more careful than praise. An observation made honestly. Precise, she said. You said exactly what you meant without decorating it. That's not common in my court. I imagine not. They rode on. After a while she said, almost despite herself, I'm sorry about that, of course. Don't be, he said. I've been announced by heralds in 4 languages. Of course is the most honest reception I've had. She almost laughed. The almost surprised her. Chapter 4. Stonecrest Hold was built into the side of a mountain with the grim practicality of Lycan architecture. No ornamentation, no unnecessary stone, Just walls that were meant to stand and towers that were meant to see. The garrison soldiers who snapped to attention as Caleb rode through the gate did not visibly react to Anastasia's presence, but she felt the quality of their attention shift. They were cataloging her, making the calculation of who she was relative to their king. A servant led her to a chamber that was Spartan but warm, a fire already burning, a basin of hot water, clean clothing laid across the bed. She stood in the middle of it for a moment and felt the strangeness of the day settle over her. 12 hours ago, she had been in Duskfang Keep, preparing for another gray morning of being invisible in plain sight. 6 hours ago, she had been publicly rejected in front of 200 wolves. 2 hours ago, she had been standing in a forest deciding whether to walk north or south. And now she was here, in a Lycan fortress, 200 miles from everything she had ever known, with a mate she had met 90 minutes ago who was apparently a king. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands. Not weeping, just existing. Just being in the body for a minute without having to perform. A knock at the door. "Come in," she said, without moving her hands. The door opened. A beat of silence. "That's concerning," said a voice she didn't recognize. She looked up. A woman had entered the room, tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair and the easy balance of someone who had been a warrior long enough that it had become her resting state. She was perhaps 45, or perhaps 145, in the way of older Lycans who wore their age strangely. She was carrying a tray with food and a cup of something that steamed and smelled of something sharp and medicinal. "I'm Commander Inara," said the woman. "I run this garrison. I've known the king since he was 14 and still had some softness in his face." She set the tray on the table. "Drink the tea. It has calderwood in it. It'll help with the bond shock." Anastasia blinked. Bond shock. When a fated bond activates fully, especially a delayed one, the body goes through something like a storm. Your nervous system is recalibrating. The tea helps. Inara looked at her with a frank assessment of someone who had long since stopped bothering with social niceties. "You're the one from Duskfang?" Was the one from Duskfang publicly rejected tonight? In front of the entire pack, yes. Inara's expression did not change, exactly, but something in her eyes went very flat and very cold. "Alpha Holt. You know him? I know of him. We keep records of every Alpha in the Northern Territories." A pause. "He's an idiot." The word was delivered so flatly, so matter-of-factly, that Anastasia experienced the bizarre sensation of wanting to laugh and cry at the same moment. "He is," she agreed. "Drink your tea." Inara moved toward the door, then stopped. "For what it's worth, and I'm only saying this because I've waited 11 years to see him look at someone the way he looked at you when you rode in. He came himself. In the middle of a northern campaign. Left his generals looking at each other, like he'd lost his mind." Anastasia wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "And what do you think?" Inara considered this. "I think he's found it," she said. She left before Anastasia could ask what, exactly, he had found. Anastasia drank the tea. It tasted like bark and something faintly sweet, and within 20 minutes the trembling in her hands that she had been controlling by sheer will since the great hall had finally, blessedly, stopped. She slept. Chapter 5. She woke to pale winter sun through a stone window and the sound of a training yard. She lay still for a moment, listening. The clang of weapons. Voices, short and clipped, in the cadence of instruction. Boot falls on frozen ground. A world that had no interest in her history and no expectations of her performance and no judgment waiting behind every doorway. It was unexpectedly wonderful. She dressed in the clothes that had been left, plain wool, well-made, and not designed to signal anything except that she was a resident of Stonecrest rather than a guest of rank, and went to find the king. She found him in the training yard. She stopped in the archway. He fought the way she imagined gravity would fight, with absolute unhurried certainty, as if the outcome were merely a formality to be observed. He was working through forms with a broadsword, and the morning light caught the steel with each arc, and she had been in enough training yards to know the difference between competence and mastery, and what she was watching was something beyond both. He saw her at the end of a sequence and didn't startle. Just finished the movement, lowered the blade, and looked at her across the yard.
"Good morning," he said.
"You're very good at that," she said, because it was true, and she had never seen any useful purpose in pretending obvious things weren't obvious. "I've had time to practice." He handed the sword to a waiting soldier and picked up a cloth to wipe his hands. "Did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months." She stepped into the yard, which felt like a declaration of something. "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to regardless." "True." She stopped a few feet from him. In the morning light, he was still the same, sharp face, silver eyes, the particular containment of someone who had learned to keep most of themselves inside. "What happens now?" "Practically speaking, I'm a rejected mate with no pack and a public record. You're a Lycan King in the middle of a campaign. The bond exists. So what does that actually look like as a process?" He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression that she was beginning to recognize, a slight quality of recalibration, as if she kept saying things that required him to update his expectations. "Normally," he said, "a Lycan King who finds his mate takes her to the capital for the formal presentation. There's a period of acquaintance. The court meets her. The nobles make their assessments. The bond is formalized in ceremony." "Normally," she repeated. "And not normally?" "Not normally," he said. "She was found the night of her rejection, in a forest, 2 territories from mine, during an active campaign. So we adapt." "How much weight does the court put on the rejection mark?" "They'll know what happened. They'll draw conclusions, unflattering ones." "Some." He held her gaze. "The bond between a Lycan King and his mate supersedes it, legally and socially. But I won't pretend the whispers won't happen." "Whispers I can manage," she said. "I've been managing whispers since I was 16. She looked at him steadily. "What I need to know is whether you're presenting me to your court as someone to be managed, or someone who stands beside you." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. "Beside me," he said. It was simple. It was direct. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of answer you gave when you meant it and didn't need to dress it up. "Then we have a lot of ground to cover," she said. "We do. I don't know your court, your politics, your enemies, or your customs. I know Duskfang politics, which I suspect is only marginally useful, and I know herb lore, which I suspect is even less so." "You'd be surprised. The court physician is 70 and has been talking about retiring for a decade." A pause. "I'm also told you fight." She raised her eyebrows. "You've been asking about me already?" "Hugo rode ahead last night." Hugo being my general. He was apparently unsatisfied with how little information we had and took corrective action.
She thought about this.
What did he find out? That Duskfang's warriors talk when they're nervous. Apparently several of them were nervous about how the rejection went. The corner of his mouth moved again. "Your performance reviews were, I'm told, disquieting." Something warm and startled turned over in her chest. He used that exact word? Word for word. She looked at him, this careful, contained, frankly alarming king who had ridden through the night to find her and who kept saying things that sounded, improbably, like a real person. "All right," she said. "When do we leave for the capital?" 3 days. The campaign has a natural pause point. I'd rather not take you to Stonecrest while the northern lords are still posturing." He watched her. "Does that work?" She laughed. Actually laughed, short and genuine, because she had been a person for whom things did not work for so long that the question almost didn't parse. I've just been thrown out of my home and found a king in a forest, she said. 3 days is extremely reasonable. Chapter 6. The 3 days taught her things. She learned that Caleb was not, as she had initially wondered, performing a kind of careful diplomacy with her. He did not have the particular texture of a man managing someone. She had been managed enough to recognize the pattern. What he was doing instead was, she thought, more interesting and considerably more rare. He was simply being honest. He was honest in the way of someone who had spent so long in a world of performance and maneuver that direct speech had become a luxury he permitted himself only in private, and she had walked into his private without warning. She thought this might be why he found her precision notable. She was doing the same thing, except she had never had the luxury of its alternative. On the first day, she asked to see the garrison records on the Northern Campaign, not because she needed to, but because understanding the context of where she was seemed important. He had them brought to her without question or comment. She spent the afternoon in the garrison's small library working through them, and when he found her there at dusk with notes written in the margins of her own journal, he had looked at the notes with an expression that she could not quite read. Those observations about the supply lines, he said. I know it's not my place. They're correct, he said. Hugo made the same point 2 days ago. She filed this information away under useful. On the second day, it snowed. The training yard was unusable, and half the garrison was occupied with the maintenance work that foul weather required, and she found herself in the corridor outside the main hall with nowhere particular to be. Caleb was there, leaning against the wall reading a report with the absorbed focus of a man who had learned to find working corners in busy buildings. She stopped beside him. You don't have a study? She asked. Hugo uses it when we're on campaign. There's a running argument about whose it actually is. Who's winning?
He is.
He's in it right now. She looked out the window at the falling snow. Can I ask you something personal? That sounds ominous. It's not that ominous. Have you had relationships?
Before the bond, I mean.
Other women. He looked up from his report. Yes. What happened to them? They wanted to be queen, he said. Not my queen. The queen. There's a difference. He looked back at the report. The position of Lycan Queen has an extraordinary amount of power attached to it. For a certain kind of person, that power is more compelling than the person it comes with. And you could tell. Eventually. It took me longer than it should have the first time. She thought about Silas and Nadine, about the years she had spent watching ambition dressed as affection.
The first time, she said.
There were 2. The second one I identified faster. He paused. I'm told this made me difficult to court. It made you careful, she said. He looked at her. There's a difference, she said, echoing his own phrasing back at him, and the corner of his mouth moved for the 3rd time. So there is. She looked back at the snow. I didn't love Silas either, for what it's worth. I held the bond because I had no choice, not because I wanted him. I've been wondering if that makes the rejection less painful or more. Less, I'd think, he said. I'd have agreed with you yesterday. She watched a snowflake hit the window glass and dissolve. It's less painful because I'm not grieving him, but it's more painful because what I'm grieving is the years. The time I spent making myself acceptable to a man who had already decided I wasn't. He was quiet.
6 years, she said.
I was useful for 6 years and patient for 6 years and careful for 6 years. And it made no difference at all. It made a difference, he said. She looked at him. You know their politics, their terrain, their social architecture. You know herb lore, and you know combat, and you know how to survive in a pack that wants you diminished. He held her gaze. Those 6 years built something. It didn't build what you were hoping for, but it built. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're rather better at this than I expected." "At what?" "Talking. Being a person." He looked back at his report. "I've had better material to work with than usual." On the third day, she shifted. She hadn't intended to. She had been careful, the way she was always careful, keeping her wolf contained. But she had gone to the edge of the Lycan forest alone before dawn, and the trees were so old, and the air was so cold, and something in the territory around her was so deeply, fundamentally different from Duskfang that her wolf had simply risen. Not in aggression, in recognition. "This is ours," her wolf said. She let her shift happen in the dark among the ancient trees. And what came out of the shift was not the wolf she had always been. She had always been aware that her wolf was larger than she should be, faster than she should be, stronger than she should be for a female from a common pack. But she had always pressed it down, kept it restrained, made herself the acceptable size. Out here, with the Lycan forest around her and the bond pulling her like the pull of the moon itself, there was no reason to restrain. Her wolf was extraordinary. She didn't have words for it in the moment because wolves don't think in words, they think in sensation, in instinct, in the raw language of what is. But she felt, in that dark, cold forest, what she had always been and never allowed herself to be, and it was tremendous. Ancient. Something that tasted of power in the way that rivers taste of the mountains they come from. She was still in wolf form when she sensed him. He had followed her. She should have been annoyed. She found she wasn't. His wolf was enormous. She had braced for it, knowing what Lycans were, but knowing and experiencing were different things. He was the dark at the edge of sight, massive and still, watching her from between two trees with silver eyes that were the same in either form. They regarded each other in silence. Her wolf did not feel afraid. Her wolf felt, for the first time in memory, entirely at rest. He shifted back first and let her shift back at her own pace, and when she was herself again, standing in the snow with her hair wild and her skin warm despite the cold, he said nothing immediately. "You knew," she said. "I suspected," he corrected. "When I felt you the other night, that release. It wasn't just a bond activating. It was a suppression ending." "What am I?" she asked. He looked at her with those steady silver eyes. "In the old bloodlines, the oldest ones, older even than Lycans, there are records of female wolves who carry something particular. Something that doesn't breed true, that surfaces rarely, in women who have been carrying it unknowing." He paused. "We have a word for it in the Lycan tongue. It translates, roughly, as a wolf-born queen. Not made, born." She stood in the snow and felt the forest around her and thought about 6 years of being a problem that couldn't be classified. "Silas Holt," she said quietly, "rejected a wolf-born queen in front of 200 witnesses." "Yes," Caleb said. "Does he know?" "If he does, he's considerably more foolish than I had assumed. If he doesn't," a pause.
"He will."
Something in his voice made her look at him. "Is that a threat?" she asked. "It's a statement of what is going to happen," he said calmly, "when you walk into my court and the old bloodlines recognize what you are. The news will travel." His silver eyes were very quiet. "It will reach Duskfang within a month. Perhaps sooner." She thought about Silas's face, about Petra's staring at the floor, about Nadine's satisfied smile.
"Good," she said.
Chapter 7. Stonecrest's capital city was named Vorian, and it did not look like anything Anastasia had prepared herself for. She had prepared herself for something cold, something imposing in the way that power liked to impose, all towers and intimidation, and the architectural equivalent of a man standing with his arms crossed refusing to move. She had spent years in Duskfang, which managed a certain rough grandeur, and she had assumed Lycan architecture would simply be the same thing with a larger budget. Vorian was not that. It was old. old in the way of things that have grown rather than things that have been built, its towers following the natural lines of the hills they sat on, its walls incorporating the faces of the rock as often as mortared stone, its streets threading between buildings that had been modified and expanded and layered by centuries of careful occupation. Trees grew inside its walls, enormous and old, the kind of trees that cities around them without disturbing. The central palace was more like a living mountain than a building. She rode in beside Caleb, and the people of Vorian came to the streets to watch, as they always did when their king returned, and she felt 10,000 eyes adjust to include her. She had expected whispers. There were whispers. She had expected some hostility. She was a stranger, an outsider, a rejected mate from a common pack. There would be people in this court who would find each of those things objectionable and who would make sure she knew it. What she had not expected was the quality of attention from certain people, older wolves, standing in clusters near the city gates, who watched her ride past with an expression that was not assessment but recognition. The same expression, on different faces. Some of them actually lowered their heads. She kept her own expression neutral and stored it away to think about later. The court presentation happened 2 days after their arrival, when the formalities had been satisfied, a proper reception, the throne room, full attendance of the nobility, the castle steward announcing her with a careful version of her history that emphasized the bond and smoothed over the rejection without erasing it. The nobility of Vorian was, in the main, ancient. These were not wolves who had climbed to their positions. They had been born into bloodlines so old that the stories of their origins were written in books shelved in rooms that smelled of centuries. They looked at her with the sophisticated impassivity of the powerful, giving nothing away. Then an old woman in the front row said, quietly but clearly enough to be heard, "She's a blood queen." The room changed. She felt it before she understood it. A shift in the quality of attention, like the moment before lightning. The old woman, who was 80 at minimum and moved with the comfortable certainty of someone who had outlasted every enemy she had ever made, held Anastasia's gaze across the throne room. Anastasia held it back. "My Lady Vesa," said the court steward, with the pained expression of a man who had been planning a smooth formal presentation and now found himself on unfamiliar terrain. "Don't give me that tone, Farron," said the old woman. "I'm 212 years old, and I know a blood queen when I see one." She was still watching Anastasia. "I haven't seen one in 60 years. I wasn't sure I'd see one again." "Lady Vesa," said Caleb from the throne, in a tone that was not loud but was absolute, "is speaking correctly." The room went very still. Anastasia looked at him. He was watching her, not them, with that steady silver gaze that she was beginning to read better now, the specific quality of his attention when he was communicating something he meant. She turned back to the court. "I'm told the translation is Wolf-born Queen," she said, because she had been trying precision, and she was going to continue trying precision until someone gave her a reason to stop. "I don't know yet what that means in practice. I intend to find out." A pause. "I'd appreciate your help." Lady Vesa looked at her for a long moment, then made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Well," said the oldest living Lycan in the room, "at least she's honest." The court thawed, slightly, in the way of very old institutions faced with someone who doesn't know well enough to pretend. Chapter 8. The court taught her things too. Not all of them were comfortable. The first was that the rejection mark was, as Caleb had warned, visible. Not literally. It wasn't branded on her skin, but wolves could sense it, a faint dissonance in her signature that said, "Returned, unwanted, set aside." She had known this intellectually. Living with it was different. There was a faction of the nobility who wore their opinions on the matter with the transparent subtlety of people who had never had to be subtle. Lord Harwick of the Western Territories, who had a daughter of precisely marriageable age and a 4-generation history of lobbying for alliance marriages with the Lycan throne. the Countess Vane, who smiled at Anastasia with careful warmth while managing to communicate in every other way that she found her presence regrettable, and a young lord named Tavish, who was so blatant in his skepticism that he had apparently not yet learned the difference between speaking his mind and making an enemy. A Duskfang wolf, he said, at the first formal dinner, with the air of a man making an obvious observation that someone needed to make. Duskfang is a third-tier northern pack. No land, no particular military history, no distinguished bloodlines. He looked at Anastasia, who was seated 4 places away, and could hear him perfectly. No offense intended. None taken, she said pleasantly. I imagine it must be very difficult to have spent your entire life surrounded by old bloodlines and distinguished history and still manage to be this boring. Dead silence. Tavish's expression shifted through several stages rapidly. Caleb, at the head of the table, did not visibly react, but Hugo, seated 3 places from the king, made a sound into his wine cup that he converted, with practiced skill, into a cough. Lady Anastasia, said the court steward, with the haunted look of a man trying to hold a cart together with his bare hands, perhaps. No, Farron, let her speak, said Lady Vesa, who was seated across from Anastasia and who seemed, over the past 2 days, to have developed an opinion on the matter that could be charitably described as enthusiastic. That's the most interesting thing said at this table in a decade. A decade is generous, said Anastasia. I'd have thought more like 3. Lady Vesa actually cackled. Tavish did not speak again that evening. The second thing she learned was that the court's political landscape was considerably more complicated than she had initially mapped. There were 3 distinct power factions, aligned by territory and old grievance, all of whom had various opinions on the succession. Caleb had no children, and his nearest male relative was a cousin who nobody seemed particularly enthusiastic about. The presence of a fated mate in the palace had rearranged the calculus of everyone's plans, and some of those plans had been a long time in the making. She found this out not from Caleb. He gave her information when she asked for it, but he was not, she noted, in the habit of providing context she hadn't requested, but from an unexpected source. Hugo found her in the library on her 3rd day in the palace. He was a large, direct man who seemed to have made a personal commitment to never saying anything with 3 words that he could say with 1. He had a scar that ran from his jaw to his temple and the kind of hands that came from a lifetime of professional violence, and he sat down across from her with the air of a man conducting a military assessment. You want to know the factions, he said. She put down her reading. I thought I was being subtle. You weren't. How unsubtle was I? You spent 40 minutes this morning in the records room cross-referencing noble family trees with territorial maps. Farron mentioned it. He didn't look apologetic about this information exchange. I'm the person who runs the king's intelligence. If you want actual information rather than what the records tell you, ask me. She regarded him for a moment. Why are you offering this? She asked. Because you're going to find out anyway, and accurate information is better than inaccurate information when you're navigating court politics. A pause. And because I've been waiting 11 years for him to not look completely hollow, and you fixed that in a week, so I'm feeling charitable. She thought about this. Hollow, she repeated. Hugo looked at her with the expression of a man who had just realized he had said more than he intended to. The factions, he said firmly. She let it go, but she stored it. The third thing she learned was that somebody had sent a message to Duskfang. She found out because Petra came. She woke 4 mornings after the court presentation to find a message from the palace gates, a female wolf, requesting an audience, giving the name Petra of Duskfang. She could have refused. She considered it for about 30 seconds. She went to the receiving room. Petra looked worse than Anastasia felt. She had ridden hard, Her traveling clothes were muddy, and she had dark circles under her eyes, and she was carrying herself with the particular posture of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation for 3 days and is now terrified of how it will go.
She walked in.
She stopped. She looked at Anastasia across the room. "I told him," she said, before Anastasia could speak. Anastasia waited. 2 months ago, when I found out. I didn't tell you because I was afraid Silas would punish me, but I did go to Silas himself. I told him that if he rejected you publicly, it would come back on him. That it wasn't right." She swallowed. "He told me to stay out of it. That I didn't understand what you were." Anastasia felt a stillness settle over her. "And what did he say I was?" she asked. "He said you were—" Petra stopped, pressed her lips together. "He said you were something that would eventually challenge his authority if he claimed you. That you were too powerful. That the pack didn't need a Luna who would overshadow the Alpha." Her eyes were red. He knew.
Anna.
He knew what you were, or something close to it. He rejected you because he was afraid of you. The silence lasted a long time. "I should have told you," Petra said. "I know. I was a coward, and I should have told you regardless of the consequences, and I didn't, and I'm sorry. I'm here to say that. I don't expect forgiveness. I just—" Her voice broke very slightly. "I needed to say it to your face." Anastasia looked at her oldest friend, looked at the genuine misery on her face, the exhaustion, the 3-day ride that had been an act of penance. She thought about Silas, about those 6 years, about standing in the Great Hall. And she thought about a forest and a king and 3 days in a garrison and a court that was beginning, slowly and with certain reservations, to take her measure. "Silas is a fool," she said at last. "And you are a coward. Those are different sizes of failure." Petra was very still. "I'm not there yet," Anastasia said. "Forgiveness. I need more time with the anger." She paused. "But I don't want you out of my life permanently either. So come back in a month." Petra's breath came out unsteadily. "Okay," she said. "Okay. I will." She left. Anastasia stood in the receiving room alone for a moment, and then she went to find Caleb. He was at the war table with Hugo, going over supply routes. He looked up when she came in with an expression that processed her immediately, something in her face, she imagined, or something in the bond, or both. "What happened?" he said. "My friend came to tell me that Silas knew what I was," she said. "He rejected me because he was afraid of what I'd become." Caleb said nothing. Hugo was very still. "He looked at something extraordinary," she said, "and he threw it away because it frightened him." She looked at Caleb. "I'm not saying this to make you feel things about it. I'm saying it because it changes what I understand about the last 6 years, and I needed to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't, I don't know, manage the information." "I won't manage it," he said. "I know." She exhaled. "It's strange. Finding out the reason makes it worse and better at the same time. Worse because it was deliberate. Better because you weren't imagining it." "Yes." He held her gaze. "For what it's worth," he said, "he was right to be afraid." She looked at him. "Not of you specifically," he said. "Of what he would have had to become to deserve you." It was perhaps the most precise thing anyone had ever said to her. Chapter 9. The formal claiming ceremony of the Lycan King's mate was, according to Lady Vessa, who had attended for in her 212 years, something between a state occasion and a religious ceremony with the emotional intensity of both. "It's the bond made public," Vessa told her, 3 days before the appointed date. They were in Vessa's suite, which smelled of old books and dried flowers and the particular kind of incense that only the very old seemed to find comforting. Everything up until now has been negotiation. The ceremony is the declaration. "What does it involve, exactly?" Anastasia asked. "The sharing of names in the old tongue. The blood mark. The king marks you and you mark him, so the bond is physically acknowledged on both sides. And the wolf recognition. Both of you shift in front of the court. Your wolves acknowledge each other publicly. Vesa paused. The last part tends to be the one people remember. Because when a Blood Queen's wolf acknowledges her mate in a formal ceremony, it is. Vesa searched for the word. Arresting. I've seen it twice. The first time, I thought the ceiling was going to come down. Anastasia thought about her wolf in the Lycan forest, about what had come out when she stopped restraining it. Will the court be all right with it? She asked. Vesa made a dismissive sound. Lord Harwick will have opinions. He always has opinions. The rest of them will remember why they live under the oldest throne in the world. She looked at Anastasia with eyes that had seen 2 centuries of everything. The question is whether you're all right with it. I've been all right with less, Anastasia said. Vesa looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached forward and patted her hand, which was such an unexpected gesture that Anastasia almost startled. I know, Vesa said gently. I know you have. That's rather the point. The night before the ceremony, she could not sleep. She lay in her chamber listening to the palace breathe, the distant sound of wind over Vorian's towers, the movement of guards on the walls, the bone-deep silence of a building that had held 2 centuries of lives, and she thought about what she was agreeing to. She thought about it honestly. It would have been easy, she thought, to dress this up as romantic fate, the moon goddess's design, the bond's inevitability, the beautiful story of a cast-off girl claimed by a king. She had enough self-awareness to notice the story's appeal and enough intellectual honesty to distrust her own susceptibility to it. So she thought about it plainly. She was agreeing to bind herself to a man she had known for 2 weeks. He was cautious and direct and occasionally unexpectedly honest in ways that caught her off guard. He had not tried to manage her or diminish her, or tell her what she was in ways that were actually instructions about what to be. When she had drawn lines, he had acknowledged them without making her feel difficult for having them. When she had spoken bluntly, he had responded in kind. He had spent 11 years ruling alone and looked, according to Hugo, hollow. She had spent 6 years in a pack that was afraid of her and learned to make herself small. These were not, she thought, unrelated. A knock at her door.
Late.
She had been awake. She called, "Come in," and sat up. He was there. He was not in his armor or his king's finery. He was in plain dark wool, the kind he wore in the training yard, and he looked. She searched for the word, uncertain. She had not seen him uncertain before. It looked strange and genuine on him, like light in an unexpected place. I wanted to check, he said. On what? Whether, he stopped. Started again. I've been asking you to adapt very quickly to a great deal. You haven't asked me to do anything, she said. That's been somewhat conspicuous. I've placed you in a context that required adaptation. That's a diplomatic way of describing it. She studied him. Are you checking whether I want to go through with the ceremony tomorrow? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. I do. Something in his face changed, not much, but enough. It doesn't bother you, he asked, that I'm this. A gesture at himself, vague and uncharacteristically self-conscious. That I'm not. Easy, she offered. I was going to say warm. You're warmer than you think you are, she said. You're just economical about it. She looked at him. I don't need ease. I had someone who was surface easy and bone cold for 6 years.
She paused.
I'd take your version over that every time. He was quiet. Go to sleep, she said. You have a ceremony to perform tomorrow. So do you. I know. That's why I'm being efficient. She laid back down. Good night, Caleb. There was a pause. Good night, Anastasia.
The door closed.
She lay in the dark and felt the bond hum warm and certain in her chest and thought, all right. All right then. Chapter 10. The throne room of Vorian held 400 people and was full. She walked in on her own. She had considered having Lady Vessa accompany her, or Hugo, or Petra. But Petra was not there yet, and Vessa had looked at her when she suggested it with an expression that said, clearly, that a blood queen walked herself in. She walked herself in. The court was arrayed in full formal dress, centuries of nobility standing in tiers along the walls, and she walked through them in dark green, not the pale traditional colors of a Lycan claiming ceremony, which she had been informed and had quietly declined, because she was not going to begin this life by wearing someone else's colors, with her dark hair loose and her spine straight and every suppressed, restrained, carefully managed thing inside her finally, fully awake.
She felt them feel it as she passed.
Not all of them. The younger wolves didn't have the sensitivity for it. But the old ones, the ancient bloodlines who had served this court for generations, turned to watch her with that look she had seen at the city gates. That quiet, settled recognition. Lord Harwick did not turn to look with recognition. He turned to look with the expression of a man whose plans were rearranging themselves unfavorably. She met his gaze as she passed. She smiled. Caleb was at the end of the room in his formal king's armor, and she had seen him every day for 2 weeks and somehow had not prepared herself for the specific quality of seeing him look at her like that. Like she was the answer to a question he had been asking for 11 years and hadn't known how to ask. She stopped in front of him. He offered his hand. She took it. The ceremony began. She will not, later, be able to describe most of it in detail. The words in the old tongue that ran together and apart, the blood mark that burned warm on the inside of her wrist where she made the corresponding mark on his, the weight of 400 witnesses and centuries of tradition pressing in from all sides. What she will remember is the moment he said her name in the old tongue, which was a word that meant, Lady Vessa had explained, something between chosen and recognized, and she said his, which meant the same, and the bond in her chest went from a hum to something vast and resonant, and completely without fear. Then the shift. She let it happen the way she had let it happen in the Lycan forest, without restraint, without modulation, without the years of careful self-management, and the court saw what she was. Later, Hugo would describe it to the soldiers who hadn't been inside as, you know the feeling before a storm. When the air changes and you know something is coming.
Like that.
Except the storm was standing in the throne room. Harwick took a step backward. Vessa, in the front row, closed her eyes briefly and smiled. Caleb's wolf rose to meet hers, enormous and dark and ancient, and in the exchange of recognition between their wolves there was something that did not translate into human language, something that was simply true, the way the ground under your feet is true, certain in the way that certainties older than words are certain. Then they were themselves again, standing in the throne room of Vorian, and the court was very quiet. Caleb looked at her. Well, he said under his breath, in the specific dry register she was beginning to recognize as his version of feeling things strongly, that's definitive. Was there doubt? She murmured back. Not on my side. Nor mine. She turned to face the court. 400 wolves, ancient bloodlines and young nobility and everything between, watching her. Harwick with his recalibrating expression. Tavish looking like a man who had revised several opinions simultaneously. Vessa with her 212-year-old satisfaction. Hugo by the door, arms crossed, looking vindicated. I imagine, she said, to all of them, clearly enough to be heard in the back of the room, we have a great deal of work to do. The message from Duskfang arrived in spring, when Vorian was thawing and the first green was showing on the ancient trees inside the palace walls. It was addressed to the Lycan Queen, which still felt strange in the way of things that are new and real at once. She read it in the window seat of the library, where she spent her mornings, with the early sun warm on her back and the sounds of a waking city below. Silas Holt, Alpha of the Duskfang Pack, was writing to request a formal diplomatic meeting. The territory, the letter explained, had undergone certain internal changes. Nadine was no longer the Alpha's companion. This was stated in careful language that said very little and implied quite a lot. There had been questions among the Pack's elders and warriors about the leadership decisions of the past year. There was interest among those same parties in establishing improved relations with the Lycan Kingdom. There was no direct mention of her, but the letter existed because of her. She read it twice. Then she set it down, looked out the window at the spring city, and thought about the great hall of Duskfang Keep and the 200 faces and the cold stone floor. Petra was there, now, in the chair by the fire, frowning at a letter of her own. She had come back after a month as instructed, and she and Anastasia were not where they had been exactly, but somewhere real, somewhere that had been honestly rebuilt rather than just reassumed. Silas wrote. Anastasia said. Petra looked up very still. He wants a diplomatic meeting. Petra's expression moved through several things in quick succession. What are you going to do? Anastasia thought about it. She thought about Caleb, who was in the war room 2 corridors away doing exactly the same thing he had been doing every morning since she'd known him, except that he occasionally looked up now when she walked in, and the hollow that Hugo had noticed was no longer there. She thought about Vesa, who had become a weekly fixture in her schedule and who was currently teaching her the old tongue with an intensity that suggested she had been waiting 200 years for a student who wouldn't give up. She thought about court sessions, where she was finding her footing, slowly and sometimes loudly, and once memorably in a way that made Hugo put his head in his hands, but finding it nonetheless. She thought about the territory that her wolf recognized as hers now, the ancient forest and the stone city, and the bond that was no longer a leash or a cage or a thing to be endured, but simply hers. She picked up her quill. She wrote a reply. It was professionally courteous. It was also, she thought, one of the most precisely worded documents she had ever produced. Every phrase doing exactly the work it needed to do, no more, no less, leaving Alpha Holt in no doubt whatsoever about the balance of power in this correspondence, and in no doubt whatsoever about who he was addressing. She signed it. Anastasia Drave, Queen of the Lycan Kingdom, Lady of Vorian, Blood Queen of the Old Compact. She looked at the name for a moment. Then she smiled. It was not the brittle, controlled smile of a woman walking out of a great hall with her heart breaking in silence. It was something entirely different, something warmer and more dangerous, and entirely her own. She sealed the letter and sent it south.